Professor Robert Eisenman, author of a number of books on the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christianity and the early church.
Yes.
For instance, James, the brother of Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, and books like that. And some of them are out from Penguin, some of them are out from other publishers and are still available. In fact, nothing drew me to it. I had been in the East Coast environment and also in Israel. I had gone to Ivy League universities. I had studied originally things like engineering, physics, and then philosophy and literature and things like that at Cornell. I originally thought I wanted to be a nuclear physicist and so on. And I suddenly realized that I didn't really like the sort of colleagues I was encountering in that line of activity. So I moved over into philosophy, and that was interesting, but rather dry. And finally, I got into literature. So I thought I was going to be a writer. And after college, I did what most writers think they're going to do. They go off into the world. In my view, since Paris was supposed to be the bohemian writing center of the world, I took off as fast as I could to Paris on the left bank. That was in the late 50s. So I started traveling around, and Vienna had always appealed to me. I went into some people in Paris recommended I go into the Austrian Alps to do some writing. So I did, made a lot of good friends there. That wasn't enough for me. So I kept moving to Turkey and Istanbul and Athens and so on. I was going to go to a Greek island. So I went to Idra. It was the closest to the Greek mainland. Still trying to do some writing. And I went back to Europe and Paris and hung out in those kinds of places. Went to kibbutzim in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I went to NYU in a course called Hebrew and Near East Studies, and I originally got a scholarship in Hebrew. Then when I wanted to do a doctorate, I went to Columbia, and I didn't have any in Hebrew. I got one in Arabic. I went to Columbia for my doctorate in Middle East languages and cultures, and I did a dissertation on Islamic law. So I said, well, I want to go back to Israel. So I wrote a dissertation so I could get fellowship aid on Islamic law in Mandate Palestine and modern Israel. That's now published from E.J. Brill in Leiden. So I did my work, as you see, in Islamic studies. I had a background in, Hebraic, Bible, all these other things from my earlier interests on the kibbutz family when I was reading these things privately, but I never really formally studied them that much. General survey courses. So after I finished my doctorate, which took me 5 years to write and so on, at that time, jobs were freezing up in America, and there weren't a lot of jobs going. And I was offered a job at a place called Cal State Long Beach in the Religious Studies Department. As a course, to be able to teach a good course, Islamic law. Well, no one was going to take a course in Islamic law. I didn't realize at the time that you had to fill the courses up. Jerry Brown was governor, actually, at that time still. And, he had made, you had to have a minimum number of bodies in the course for it to go. So if you didn't fill it, it didn't go. So I had to start teaching courses that would go. And that meant people were interested in Christianity. That's what people were interested in. Jesus, the Bible, courses like that would go. If you get an Islamic, now you could get an Islamic civilization course to go, but back then they wouldn't even know what it was. So one course that was on the book was intertestament literature. Well, who's going to take a course in intertestament literature? They wouldn't even know what it was. So I changed the title because I'd taken a Dead Sea Scrolls course for my master's at NYU in Hebrew and Near East Studies. Dead Sea Scrolls. So I changed it to Dead Sea Scrolls. I thought that was a catchy title, and people started registering. And I had to teach it every single term. Now, people at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you name it, those kind of universities, they teach 1 or 2, even 3 courses maybe a year. We had to teach 4 courses a term. It was mandated by state law. You had to get these courses to go. So that was bad and good, because those chaps, as decent scholars as they are, don't really have to do a lot of teaching. Therefore, they don't learn a lot outside of their main field. I had to teach, and in teaching you learn. And that's what happened to me. I began to know the Dead Sea Scrolls because I had the whole collections of them backwards and forwards. I began to know the New Testament backwards. I had to teach a New Testament course. I invented a course called Paul and James because I discovered who they were by reading these courses. I didn't even know there was a guy called James when I started all of this. You know, and when I was reading the book of Acts, it jumped out at me. Who is this person? You know, particularly in the we portion of Acts, the later portion. You know, he becomes very important, and you realize he's the leader of the early church if you read it carefully. And then Paul is in conflict with him. And who would have known that? I wouldn't have known that. You won't teach it. You learn it at graduate school. You only learn it through teaching, reading the text over and over and over again. Well, this is how I got into the fields which I got into. And then I started writing in those fields, and all the rest is history. So that's how I got into these fields. I started writing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. From the Dead Sea Scrolls, I wrote about early Christianity. From early Christianity, I got into the issues of what kind of Christianity we're talking about: Palestinian Christianity, overseas Christianity, Pauline Christianity, Romanized Christianity, or Dead Sea Scrolls style Christianity. Well, I think Christianity, you see, is a name based on a Greek word, Christ. So it's nothing to do with Palestine per se, but they're trying to translate in some manner a concept they don't really understand, the Messiah. The people who are working in the Greek language to present this to the Greco-Roman world, they're trying to find words that will reproduce a concept in the Hebrew language and in the scrolls or in the Bible that we're calling Messiah, Moshiach, whatever word you want to apply. And so the closest they could get was this, I don't know where they got it, frankly, this Christus, or Crestus at one point someone uses anyway. So the minute you're talking about Christ, Christus, Christianity, you know you're talking about a Greco-Roman sort of production, a Hellenized a piece of material aimed at a Greco-Roman world. And so that's where you get that form from in that kind of enclave. But as I discovered, that did not reflect what I later started calling Palestinian Christianity. And I didn't even like the term Palestinian Christianity because I don't think it was Christianity in Palestine. That's a Greek term. It's really Palestinian Messianism. And what I discovered in doing the scrolls more and more was that other people who were working on the scrolls but being Christians themselves couldn't see any connection of the scrolls to Christianity because the Christianity they knew was nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Christianity they know is love, turn the other cheek, otherworldly, etc., peaceful, and so on. The scrolls are nothing like that. And even though they want to try to call the scrolls Essenes, they're not Essenes in the normal sense of the word Essenes because the scrolls are apocalyptic. They are full of anger. They don't love their enemy. They hate their enemy. They say, hate the sons of the pit. Now, if you have a document that says, hate the sons of the pit, how can you compare it or even turn it into something that says, love your enemy? So the love your enemy is very attractive. I'm not saying it isn't attractive, but it doesn't reflect Palestinian messianism. It reflects Greco-Roman Christianity. So the Christ we get pictured in the Gospels, as we call them, as they've come to be called, to my mind, as I learn more and more about these things, is highly Paulinized. Because Paul was someone who was familiar with the Greco-Roman world. He seems to have been either born there or come out of there. He says he's from Tarsus, which his family seems to have lived in southern Anatolia, today's Turkey, which was Hellenistic at that time. But I don't think that he actually is in origin from those areas. I came to appreciate it, and this is where you get really deep into history. And most of the scholars of the scrolls, they're not interested in any of this. They don't go anywhere except, is this word correct? Is that word correct? The paleography, the handwriting, this, that. They don't know they're covering anything up. They don't recognize they don't recognize anything here as familiar to them in the Christianity that they know. But they don't know that the Christianity that they know was actually a Greco-Roman production that had very little to do with what was going on in Palestine at the time. Well, these are historical insights you're talking about. I was speaking more generally first. I don't want to get into the specific historical points that you're raising yet. I just wanted to talk about the mindset of the people working on the scrolls, why they couldn't come to terms with these materials, and how their prior belief systems or familiar belief appreciations, whether they believers or not, influence their perception of the scrolls. So what they felt that basically they were trying to say that the scrolls weren't Christian because, as I was telling you, you can't have a document that says hate the sons of the pit that is preaching a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth, and so that thinks the holy angels are warrior angels, that thinks that they have to be totally pure because if they are not totally pure, they're not unsophisticated people, and they're not simplistic, that they think that they don't have enough power to deal with the might of the Roman Empire. They need the holy angels, who are warrior angels, to join their camps, as they call them where they're living, in order to defeat the might of Rome. They want to defeat the might of Rome. Now, this is not Christianity as we know it. This is Messianism in Palestine, but this is not, because these hordes, these hosts, shall we say, of warrior holy angels and the men of the scroll community are going to be led by the Messiah in this final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. So what is supposed to happen in their view, and this is in the war scroll we call it, the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Nobody who is a believing Christian could say this is a Christian document. They just wouldn't recognize as such, but it's a messianic document. And that's what I tried to begin to clarify. I didn't know it either. But as I taught this material and I began to read through it, and I knew the establishment reigning theories of scroll studies, I began to see that these did not fit the picture of the materials that I was teaching in my classes. So what I was finding is in the scrolls, and it's fairly consistently so, the scrolls are really pretty consistent. They don't have a document that is opposing another document. The whole mindset is more or less the same across the spectrum of the newer documents, shall we call them, the more recently revealed documents. That you don't have, these are very consistent documents, and they're a very aggressive apocalyptic messianism. So I started calling this the Messianic movement in Palestine. I even went further. And this is more recently. As I got more, I hate to say sophisticated, but I think I got sophisticated. Since the documents of the scrolls were speaking about the sons of Zadok. See, Zadok was the high priest in David's time. So they meant by this priestly in some way. Zadok also can translate in Hebrew ZDK as righteousness, Zedek. So they were playing around with these concepts, playing on words, righteousness, priesthood, high priesthood, and so on. Since the group in Josephus, the historian of the period, that is supposed to represent the priesthood are called the Sadducees, coming from the word Zadok, and you can see that the Sadducees in the New Testament are supposed to be the priestly class, right? The only problem is we have here a huge problem. The Sadducees in the New Testament, or the gospel, shall we say, the pictures that we have there, are collaborating Sadducees. Sadducees collaborating with the Herodian upper class monarchy imposed upon Palestine by the Roman Empire and the Roman army and the Roman troops. So King Herod came into power with the defeat of the Maccabees, the ones that the Jews celebrate Hanukkah for. The defeat of the Maccabees in the 40s to 30s BC. The Maccabees had taken over sometime in the 60s, 70s, 80s BC period. The wars went on then. So by that time, the Herodian family which was not even a Palestinian, not even a Jewish family, actually came from Gaza partially, and partially across into Edom. Petra was a mixture of that background, but it became Judaized in order that they could become kings in Palestine. So Herod himself was one of these people, and he was converted to Judaism. But this was nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls Judaism. It was a Pharisee kind of Judaism. That's why most people think of Judaism as Pharisee Judaism. And the New Testament thinks of Judaism as Pharisee Judaism. And the Sadducees are the high priests. Aha! But they're not all the high priests. There's opposition high priests. And that's what we see. This is really, when you start to do this, looking deeper into the meaning and substance of the scrolls. Now, the academic curia or establishment that was in control of the scrolls was more interested in translating the documents and didn't really come to terms with the meaning of the documents themselves. So when they saw the term sons of Zadok there, it didn't ring a bell to them that these could be Sadducees. How could these documents be Sadducees? No. These are Essenes. These are not Sadducees. But you see, because look, their attitudes don't look like Sadducees in Josephus, Sadducees in the New Testament. What are these? They're opposition Sadducees. They're Sadducees following the Maccabees, who were thrown out of power and went into exile and so on and so forth. But they do claim Zadokite, Sadducee descent. But they are an aggressive, anti-Roman, anti-Herodian, anti-establishment, pro-temple form of Sadduceeism. So I started calling these, people thought I was crazy, but I don't think I'm crazy, Messianic Sadducees. Messianic, I mean, what? Messianic, how can you have Sadducees who are, Sadducees are collaborators, they're establishment party, they're this, they're that, they're no good, they persecute Christians, they throw Jesus into prison, etc. Yes, but not the Sadducees we're talking about out in the wilderness, out in the Dead Sea Scrolls, waiting for the army of holy angels. Not the Sadducees who wrote the documents that we now have, which are in fact the Messianic movement of Palestine. That's how I came up with all these. Sure, I need a break. Well, look, the problem with Jesus, a Greek name, if we can call him Joshua, Yeshua, whatever. I don't even know what he might have been called in Palestine if he had a everyday street name as such, because Yeshua is a very meaningful name, meaning savior, he who saves. So it's a little bit, or a second Joshua, if you want. So he may have been called that, and I don't say he wasn't. But the point of the matter is, we don't have any documentation about him except this material coming through the Gospels or spin-offs of the Gospels. So that is a whole literature. The Gospels, the pseudo-Gospels, the rejected Gospels, the extra Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, or this Gospels, or that. There's a vast literature explosion in that area. That's the data, but that's not necessarily historical, and it may have been based on some original activity that was literary done in some places, because we have no Hebrew originals. There are some Aramaic type Gospels, but I think they're taken from the Greek. In any case, I don't even think there's an Aramaic original. I think the originals are in Greek. I may be wrong, but that would be an argument scholars would have to pound out with each other over decades, generations, and they probably would never agree anyway. I've tried to emphasize something that comes through very, very strongly in the more autobiographical sections of what is generally referred to as the New Testament. That is, the Paul's letters that are mostly the ones that people agree on authentic. People think that they're authentic. I don't think all of them are authentic, and I don't make these judgments myself because I'm not able to say, except through internal data, what's authentic and what isn't authentic. But there are some letters that people agree on are fairly authentic. And there's some material in the book of Acts that is fairly historical, not of the kind of the Gospels. So if you look at the book of Acts, and this is where a believing Christian can actually make these determinations for themselves, his or herself, you notice that the first 15 chapters or so of Acts it's considered written by the same writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And Luke seems to be a traveling companion of Paul in Acts. And also in Galatians, he's referred to. He seems to be some problem there with Luke in Galatians. In any case, somewhere around chapter 15, up to that point, the material resembles the Gospels in its tone, texture, and outlook. But after chapter 15, it completely changes, because the narrative goes from a third-person narrative, he, they, something, she, to a first-person narrative, I, we. That's really startling. And we call that the we document, because it actually looks like an authentic travel document, or a diario, if you want, written by someone. I did this, we did that, I did that, we did that. If you remember, by the time you get to Acts 21, it's saying, Paul and I, we went up to Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And so it's pretty autobiographical at that point, but from a Pauline standpoint. It's not autobiographical about, let's say, Peter. It's not autobiographical, let's say, James. It's from someone who's with Paul, Luke, let us say. And it's first-person narrative, we. First-person plural. And there's, to my mind, historical material there. And I can give you an example. Acts 21:21. James speaking. Earlier, we didn't even know who James was. Acts never introduced this James. It did have a James, but he's James, the brother of John. He's not the James talking in Acts 21:21. He's someone who goes off to Spain, perhaps, or someplace and evaporates, disappears, is killed, or whatever it is. He's someone's brother, you see, and that's why you have to have a little bit of suspicion about the earlier version if he's being written out and changed into a different character. Because as long as he's the brother of someone, then instead of the brother of Jesus, he may be being called the brother of John. But in any case, he's the leader of the church. Until Peter is supposed to be the leader of the church. Peter, rock upon which I build my church. This is all in the Gospels. But you see in the autobiographical narrative parts of the church, that's what struck me very strongly as I was doing that teaching, and ultimately, well, I hate to say blew my mind, but it did explode within my mind that we have a different picture of what was going on here in these narrative portions of the literature that are more reliable than the, shall we say, more literary portions of the literature. So at this point, the we documents, but you see, Paul, we are all, meaning we are all zealots for the law. Well, that just would bang you right in the face. It's in Acts. It's in the we portion of Acts. When you see a line like that you know is historical because no one could have created out of the blue, then you know there's a lot of non-historical material that has been created in all these other compositions. And just that line alone should blow your mind. But you see, Paul, we are all zealots for the law. Well, we didn't know early Christians were zealots for the law. We never heard that. Paul's no zealot for the law. Paul makes us think that the law brings a curse. The law brings death. Jesus brings life. I mean, all of his letters are arguing against the law so powerfully that we as Christians, or we who think we're Christians, I'm not one of those, but the one, I'm speaking like that, think that the law is something negative. And here James, the leader of the church, is saying we are all not only for the law, we are zealots for the law. And we see, Paul, that, you don't go into the temple. And we have some men here who are under Nazirite oath. That's a very particular form of the law. And they need, and they have to go into the temple to purify themselves, and they have to pay some expenses. So we would like you, because we know you have a lot of money. You've come from overseas. You've been raising money. You please go into the temple with some of your colleagues there and pay for some of these people we have there under Nazirite oath. And Paul, nothing loth, says, sure, I will do that. I will do that. We know that he despises the temple, that he despises Nazirite oath, that he despises the law. And yet we see what kind of a character he is. That's why I'm not a big fan of Paul. Because Paul, to my mind, is very, how should we put it, flexible. Not only flexible, he is not a person of principle. He runs the race to win, as he says in one of his letters. I believe in winning, not beating the air. I think that's in either 1 Corinthians. I think that's in 1 Corinthians or Romans, and that expresses his mentality. We're all the runners at the stadium are running for the prize. I believe in running for the final prize. I believe in winning, not beating the air. He uses the imagery of Roman stadium athletics. That would never happen in the scrolls. That would never happen in Palestine. That would only happen in a Hellenized mindset. So what I have tried to show from the letter to the Romans, that Paul is not just someone from Tarsus. It's very important. He's not just someone from Tarsus, because at the end of Romans, and I credit those greetings, he sends greetings to some members of the Herodian family who have been exiled because of the Jewish war that Josephus writes about at the time he's writing these things, to Rome. And, he says, send my regards to my kinsman Herodion in Rome. His kinsman Herodion. Herodion means the littlest Herod, the youngest Herod, his kinsman. So it came to me, my mind, and that's how I started developing these essays and points that I have, that Paul is actually from the Herodian family. Now, the Herodian family were seen as very good rulers by the Romans, and they had little kingdoms given them in northern Syria and in Asia Minor. That's why he comes from Tarsus, because whoever were his family there probably did rule a Roman province in southern Anatolia. And that, by the way, and that's why he has a Roman citizenship, because the Herodians were given Roman citizenship. This is where my details begin to lose me. I think all the way back in Pompey's time when they made them kings in Palestine. Oh, absolutely. Why was he executed? Oh, with the Gospels, he's executed because the Romans and made a mistake, and the Jews plotted against him. Well, all that is just hocus, to my mind, focus. I hate to say that. You know, the Romans, Pontius Pilate didn't make mistakes. He crucified more, we know from Josephus, he crucified more people than just about any other Roman governor. He knew exactly who he was crucifying and why and wanted to. And I don't think if it's true that he crucified Jesus, that there was any mistake whatsoever made, and the Jews didn't pull the wool over his eyes. So these are things I disagree with the Gospels about. Now, the moment you start disagreeing with the Gospels, then you're hurting Christians' feelings. Then you're hurting their religious beliefs, because these things have become over 20 centuries sacrosanct. No, who's ever questioned these things? Nobody in their right mind has ever questioned these things. Maybe some people were burnt in the Middle Ages who questioned such things, but no one with any historical knowledge has ever questioned such things. So people have just taken these things as absolute truth. But as I say in my work, ultimately, these are the products of literature. And to my mind, literature is a very facile form of history. In other words, it's much easier to form a belief about literature because it can be formed and structured in a certain way. And it's easy to remember. I mean, I remember the Iliad, I remember the Odyssey, but I don't remember all the Greek history concerning Alexander the Great and all the different political plots in Athens and in Sparta and all these things. And everything in Palestine would be almost too complicated. If you read Josephus, he's written 2 huge works, the Jewish War and Antiquities, about this. The Antiquities is like 1,000 pages, and to master all that material would be mind-boggling. So the Gospels are 3 or 4 variations on basically the same theme, and they're very easy to digest, and they're easy to enjoy, and they have some concepts in them that are very attractive. So people do find themselves feeling very close to them. But if you want to start getting into, is this an accurate picture of what occurred in Palestine in the first century, then there are people like me who say, oh, hold on a moment. That may be an accurate picture of what some people painted in Rome and Alexandria, but that may not be exactly what occurred in Palestine. And then, bam, the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in the 1890s or 1947, but some came in earlier. The Zadokite document was discovered in Cairo in the Geniza in the 1890s and so on, and you began to see other kinds of documents coming, other kinds of messianic documents. And then we did get the caves during the Arab-Israeli War of 47, 48. And once we got all these documents out, which is why I was so anxious in the 80s to fight the campaign that everyone should see all of the documents. Once we could see all of the documents, see how consistent they were, see how messianic they were, then we could see that we had an opposition messianic movement in Palestine that had a complete literature that had been totally inverted and reversed in the Gospels. So the Gospels are good. I have nothing wrong with them. They're beautiful literature. The ideals enunciated are wonderful. But I don't say the scroll. I'm not a believer in the scrolls. I don't say the scrolls are the most marvelous documents in the universe. But they are not what was occurring in Palestine. They are a Hellenized, Romanized version of. They're a Greco-Roman version of what the Romans felt comfortable with. That is, Roman centurions are pictured as recognizing the Messiah before Jews do. Love your enemies, don't make war against the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. All this is very convenient to help these documents survive in a Roman imperial framework, which is what they do, and ultimately dominate the Roman Empire by the 300s-400s. So my only argument, I don't argue with the beauty of these documents. My only argument is the historicity. So my whole thing has been from the beginning that one is literature and the other is history. You want to just do literature, fine. If you want to do history, then you have to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you may not love them, but if you want to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll get a more accurate picture of the historical Jesus than you will from the Gospels. Why? Well, first they'll explain his execution, absolutely, not in the explanation you get in the Gospels, which is, to my mind, contrived, because, as I just said earlier, Pontius Pilate didn't hesitate to crucify anybody, and he didn't have Jews convincing him of who to crucify. And but the other thing is that the scrolls give you a picture of what the Jamesian community probably looked like. I mean, we have this character that pops up in early church literature, and we don't understand it. Everywhere we hear about Eusebius in the 4th century, Hippolytus in the 2nd or 3rd, Jerome in the 5th, we start hearing about this person called James the Just. Oh, who is James the Just? James Justus, Justus, that's Latin. It goes back to dikaios in Greek, righteous, and Zadik in Hebrew. James the Tzaddik. James the Tzaddik. When I go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I can find out who the Tzaddik was, because the scrolls are all centered around the idea of Zadokite, Tzaddik, righteousness, Tzaddik. And their leader is known as the teacher of righteousness, the Moreh HaTzedek. And where do they get the Moreh HaTzedek from, teacher of righteousness? They take biblical passages, and everywhere the word Tzaddik appears that is convenient for them, they interpret in terms of something the teacher of righteousness was doing. So in the text, he's the Tzaddik. In the interpretation of the text, he's the teacher of righteousness. And what is James? The teacher of righteousness in the Christian literature. So this began to gel for me. Oh, and by the way, one last thing. As I said at the end of my James book, who and whatever James was, it had to be so with Jesus. Because just like, I'm not a great Kennedy admirer. I don't like people who are shot in a miserable, violent, brutal manner. I don't like that kind of thing, but I didn't necessarily love him. I worked on his campaign, but I found some things that he were not attractive ultimately to me. But I don't think that his brothers differed ideologically to any extent. Bobby didn't differ. The other brother didn't differ that much, and I don't think James and Jesus would have differed that much from each other. I don't think that's the way things happen. Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas, all those Gospels, I take with a grain of salt. That may be an accurate statement, but it's surprising to see there. That's what I mean. So yeah, wow. Someone that's considered to have come out of Egypt somewhere, and someone in that environment knew that James was the successor to Jesus, and so it pops up in the Gospel of Thomas. That doesn't mean that I take every word in the Gospel of Thomas as authentic. And this is the problem.